The message arrived on a Tuesday, which somehow made it worse. Dr. Mira Solenne would later say that catastrophe should announce itself on a Friday, or a holiday, some day already marked for disruption, not an ordinary Tuesday in March, with coffee going cold on her desk and a stack of ungraded papers beside her terminal. The deep listening array on Farside Station had been silent for 11 years, a monument to budget cuts and dwindling enthusiasm. Mira was the only researcher still assigned to it, more caretaker than scientist, when the receivers screamed, not a tone, not a pulse, a voice. It came compressed into 4 minutes of data, but when decoded and slowed, it resolved into a language the array's translation matrix had never been designed to pass. And yet, impossibly, past it did, fragment by fragment, as though the message itself contained the key to its own decryption. We are the Kovrenai, our home is gone. We flee a thing that does not flee from anything. It will reach your system within your generation. We do not ask you to save us. We ask only this: do not let it find you unprepared. Listen for us. We are still listening for you. Then static. Then nothing. Mira sat in the humming dark of the listening post for nearly an hour before she called anyone. She kept replaying the phrase "a thing that does not flee from anything," turning it over like a stone with no smooth side. By the time she reported it through proper channels, 3 other stations, one in Chile, one in orbit around Mars, one buried beneath the ice in Antarctica, had caught fragments of the same transmission, arriving at slightly different times, as though broadcast from a source moving toward Earth, at a clip that made the light lag itself measurable in days rather than years. That was when the world found out it was not alone, and that whatever the Kovrenai were running from, it was already closer than anyone wanted to admit. Governments did what governments do. They convened, they argued, they leaked classified briefings to journalists, who had no idea what they were printing. For 6 weeks, humanity treated the message as a puzzle to be solved, rather than a warning to be heeded. Then the second signal came. This one was shorter. This one was screamed. It contained no words humanity's matrices could translate, only a waveform that, when run through every analysis tool available, resolved into something disturbingly familiar, the sound of a species' entire communication network going dark at once, billions of individual transmissions, collapsing into silence within the span of 11 seconds. The Kovrenai were gone. Whatever had ended them had done so 11 light-years away, which meant the event itself was already 11 years old, by the time the dying gasp reached Earth's instruments. And the thing that did not flee from anything, the thing 11 years closer now than when the first call arrived, was still coming. Admiral Theo Achebe, recently appointed to head the newly formed Terran Defense Coalition, stood before the United Nations General Assembly and said the only thing that mattered: we have 1 generation, perhaps less, to become a species capable of fighting something we cannot yet describe. We do not have the luxury of disbelief. The world for once listened. What followed was not war. Not yet. It was the strangest mobilization in human history, not against each other, but against the silence between the stars. Nations that had spent decades distrustful of one another suddenly found themselves sharing satellite data, weapons research, fusion technology, anything that might buy time. The old divisions did not vanish, but they bent, reluctantly, under the weight of a deadline no one had chosen. Mira, plucked from her quiet listening post and installed in the heart of the Coalition's research division, became one of the few people on Earth who had actually heard the Kovrenai speak. She spent the next 3 years trying to understand not just their words, but the shape of their fear. They didn't call it a monster, she told Achebe once, late in a briefing that had run 6 hours past its scheduled end. They didn't call it an enemy. They called it a thing that does not flee from anything. That's not a description of strength, that's a description of certainty. Whatever it is, it has never once needed to retreat. Then we make sure it learns how. Achebe said. Humanity built in those years what it had never built before, not out of ambition but out of necessity. The Coalition repurposed orbital shipyards, meant for colonization into something closer to a planetary armory. Fusion drives that had once been theoretical curiosities became propulsion systems for vessels with no precedent in human engineering. Weapons research that had crawled along for decades under ethical hesitations suddenly accelerated under the brutal clarity of an existential clock. It was not a clean process. There were protests, there were defections, there were entire nations that argued the threat was exaggerated, a pretext for global militarization. Mira understood the skepticism. She had been skeptical too once. In the silence of an array, nobody thought would ever speak again. But she had heard the second signal. She had heard 11 seconds of a civilization ending, and she carried that sound with her into every committee room, every funding hearing, every late-night argument about resource allocation. "We are not building this to conquer anything," she said, again and again, to anyone who would listen. "We are building this because something out there does not know how to stop, and it is coming whether we are ready or not." The breakthrough, when it came, was not a weapon but a question answered. Dr. Aaron Vey, a quiet engineer from the orbital fabrication yards, discovered that the same compression technique, used to encode the Kovrenai's message, could be reverse applied to focus energy rather than information, turning communication theory into the foundation of a weapons platform, capable of channeling a starship's entire power output into a single coherent strike. They called the resulting vessels Aegis-class, and they built 12 of them in 4 years, an achievement that would have been called impossible in any era. Before the silence screamed, Achebe gave the order to crew them with volunteers, not conscripts. Every seat on every ship was filled within 72 hours of the announcement. Mira was not a soldier. She had never wanted to be. But when the call went out for someone who understood the Kovrenai's language well enough to attempt contact with anything that might still be listening, she stepped forward before she had fully decided to. "You don't have to do this," Achebe told her privately. "Neither did they," she said, meaning the Kovrenai, meaning the warning they had sent across 11 light-years with nothing to gain from it. Someone has to be ready to listen when it matters most. The thing, humanity never did find a better word for it, and in the end stopped trying, entered the outer system on a morning indistinguishable from any other, except that every sensor net humanity possessed lit up at once. It was not a fleet. It was not even in any conventional sense a single object. It was a presence that unfolded across cubic light minutes of space, a structure that defied easy geometry, surfaces that seemed to fold into themselves and back out again, as though space around it had been provisionally borrowed rather than occupied. The Aegis-class ships moved to intercept, not because anyone believed 12 vessels could stop it, but because retreat had never been a strategy that worked for the Kovrenai, and humanity intended to try something different. Mira rode in the command ship, the Far Side, named for the silent array where it had all begun. She kept the original 4-minute transmission queued on a secondary channel, ready to broadcast outward, the moment anything resembling a receiver showed itself. For the first 11 minutes of contact, nothing happened. The thing simply approached, indifferent, vast, exactly as advertised. A presence that did not flee from anything because it had never needed to. Then Achebe gave the order that history would remember as either humanity's finest moment, or its final one. Not to attack first, but to speak first. Mira transmitted everything. The Kovrenai's warning, translated as best humanity could manage, layered with humanity's own offering. Not surrender, not aggression, but a simple statement composed in the universal language of mathematics and light. "We have heard what you do to those who flee. We are not fleeing, we are listening. Tell us what you want. Or we will assume the answer is everything, and we will act accordingly." The silence that followed lasted 4 minutes. The same length as the original transmission, a coincidence Mira would spend years insisting was not a coincidence at all. Then the thing answered, not with words, with a single, vast pulse of focused energy that tore through the Farside's forward shields and reduced an entire support frigate to vapor in less than a second, Achebe did not hesitate. All Aegis ships, fire. What followed was 11 minutes of the most violent combat humanity had ever engaged in. 12 ships pouring everything they had into a structure that absorbed strike after strike, with what could only be described as contempt, until Vey's compression weapons found the rhythm. The thing's defenses could not anticipate, channeling humanity's full output into points of impact too narrow, too precise, too alien in their mathematics for the entity to predict. It was not victory in any clean sense. 9 of the 12 Aegis ships were lost. The far side survived only because Mira, in the final desperate seconds, rerouted the ship's remaining power into a transmission timed to the exact frequency the thing had used to respond. Not a weapon, but a question, broadcast at the precise moment its defenses were already strained past their limit. The thing did not die. Things like it, Mira would later theorize, might not be capable of dying in any sense humans understood. But it withdrew, folded itself back into whatever borrowed geometry it had arrived from, and did not return. In the years that followed, humanity built monuments not to the battle, but to the warning that preceded it. The original Farside array, restored and expanded, became the centerpiece of a new institution. The Kovrenai Memorial Listening Project, dedicated to the principle that survival began not with weapons, but with the willingness to hear a desperate call from a species already lost, and to act before it was too late. Mira spent the rest of her career there, older now, quieter, but never again doubting the value of listening into the dark. "We didn't win because we were stronger," she told a new generation of researchers, years later, in the same humming room where it had all begun. "We won because we listened when we didn't have to, and we spoke when silence would have been easier." The Kovrenai gave us that gift with their last breath. We owe it to whoever comes after us to do the same. Somewhere beyond the edge of the system, the array kept listening, patient and unblinking, for whatever might call out next, certain only that when it did, humanity would be ready to answer. Decades later, school children would visit the restored Farside station on field trips, pressing their hands against the cool viewing glass that overlooked the Great Dish Array, listening through headsets to a recording of the original transmission, the Kovrenai's voice, still strange, still aching, still carrying the weight of a civilization that gave its final breath to a warning, rather than a plea for rescue. Mira, in her last years, would sometimes sit among them, an old woman in a quiet room, and tell them the parts of the story the history books left out. The fear in Achebe's eyes before he gave the order to speak instead of strike. The names of the 9 ships lost, read aloud every anniversary, so they would never become mere statistics. The strange, persistent hope that had carried a fractured, frightened species through 4 years of impossible work toward a battle most of them never believed they could survive. "We call it Hell Unleashed," she told them once, "because that's what it looked like from the outside. Fire and fury and ships breaking apart against something we could barely comprehend. But it began with a single act of listening, and it ended with one too. Maybe that's the part worth remembering most. Not the war, the willingness to hear." The array hummed on, patient as ever, turned toward a sky that had once delivered humanity's darkest warning, and might yet, someday, deliver something else entirely.